He never really believed in lotteries, but that day he decided to take a chance. At the market, a man approached him and offered a lucky ticket. Printed across the slip were the words, "You've won $1 million." His heart nearly burst from his chest. He could already imagine how his life would change forever. But the joy didn't last long. At the lottery office they coldly told him, "This ticket is a fake." The world around him darkened. He had been tricked. And that's when he decided, this was their biggest mistake. For days he couldn't sleep. The humiliation burned more than the loss of imaginary money. It wasn't just about the ticket, it was about being treated like a fool. Someone had targeted him, played him, and laughed behind his back. The scammers thought he'd just walk away. But he wasn't going to. Not this time. He started digging. First, he returned to the same marketplace, wandering between the vendors, scanning every face. The man with the lottery slips wasn't there, but gossip always travels fast in places like this. Pretending to shop, he asked around casually, "Hey, last week some guy was selling lottery tickets here. Anyone know him?" At first, people shrugged, but eventually one old fruit seller leaned closer and whispered, "You're not the first he fooled. Calls himself Victor. Works with a group. They set up these little scams, move around, and vanish before anyone catches them." That was enough to light a fire in him. Victor. A name was the first step. He needed more. The next days he followed rumors, piecing together a trail of lies. Victor and his crew weren't just selling fake lottery tickets. They ran small cons all over town, fake jewelry, counterfeit phones, even staged charity collections. The more he uncovered, the angrier he became. It wasn't about the $1 million lie anymore. It was about justice and payback. But he knew one thing, to take them down he couldn't act recklessly. They were organized. If he rushed in he'd just be another fool on their list. He needed a plan. So he played along. He crafted a fake persona, a naive but wealthy man always flashing cash, looking for investments. Through a contact, he managed to attract Victor's attention. One evening, in a smoky backroom of a cheap bar, they finally met face to face. Victor was exactly how he imagined. Slick hair, flashy watch, a grin that screamed confidence. He extended his hand. "So, you're the guy who wants to make money fast? You came to the right man." He smiled, pretending to be impressed. "Fast money? That's all I want." Inside though, his blood boiled. He could almost hear the mocking voices from the lottery office, the smirk on Victor's face when he sold that fake ticket. But on the surface he remained calm, nodding along, listening carefully. Victor explained one of their opportunities, a fake investment scheme. The details didn't matter. What mattered was that he was now inside, gaining their trust. And with every meeting, every fake smile, he was preparing the ground for the perfect revenge. Because this time Victor wouldn't be laughing. He played the part of the fool perfectly. He laughed when Victor laughed. He pretended to be dazzled by the flashy promises. He asked dumb questions and nodded at the right moments. Everything was for show. Every careless word Victor dropped was a brick in the wall he was building. Night after night he met with the crew. He learned their routines, their signals where they stashed small loot. He learned names that slipped when they were drunk. He learned which pawnshops quietly bought from Victor's people and which cafes acted as fronts. He kept notes in a small notebook no one knew about. He saved screenshots. He copied transaction times from a fake investment spreadsheet Victor proudly showed him. But he also knew that evidence alone, no matter how damning, wouldn't do the trick. Victor's men were careful. They shredded paper, burned receipts, moved goods across the city. What would stop them was pressure, the kind that comes when the whole neighborhood knows the truth. So he started building pressure quietly, methodically, like tightening a rope around them until they couldn't wiggle free. First he found allies. A barista who'd once been conned by Victor's crew agreed to help after he showed her one of the fake tickets. A pawnshop owner, tired of being squeezed into shady deals, gave him the name of a middleman who often fenced items. He reached out to a small local reporter who loved investigative pieces and sent a carefully worded message. "I have proof of a scam network. I need to show how they operate. Can you meet?" The reporter, hungry for a story, said yes. Next, he set a small trap to test the waters. He pretended to be interested in buying a batch of supposedly rare lottery tickets for a charity draw he claimed to be organizing. Victor's eyes lit up. A charity draw meant lots of cash, many buyers, and, in Victor's world, easy resale. He arranged the meeting so others would be nearby to notice, but not so close as to tip Victor off. At the meeting, when Victor bragged about his connections and how tickets practically print money, he slipped. He named a contact in a pawnshop by mistake. He gave an offhand laugh about a back-alley man who did the hard receipts. That was enough for the pawnshop owner to pick up the thread later when the reporter asked discreet questions. With the reporter on board, the next step was public pressure. He and the journalist planned a sting, not a violent trap, not a doxing, but a staged public verification day. They would advertise a fake $1 million charity raffle, with strict validation rules. Serial numbers, receipts, IDs. They would invite people to bring suspicious tickets for a free check. At the same time, they would run a quieter operation asking local pawnshops to make their recent ledgers available for review, under the journalism protection of public interest. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. Scammers like Victor relied on silence and quick cash. Force them into records, into public screens, into buyers who asked questions and reporters who took notes, and they had nowhere to hide. They announced the event under a credible charity's name, after securing an actual small NGO willing to host and authenticate the process. They promised transparency and a reward for people who brought evidence leading to convictions. They also arranged, through the reporter's contacts, for a plainclothes police liaison to be present, not to start arrests that day, but to take official logs and guarantee the process would lead to formal inquiries. On the morning of the event, the square outside the NGO filled with people clutching crumpled slips and receipts. Some had been tricked like he had. Some had been too embarrassed to go to a station. But that day they had company and a platform. Volunteers scanned tickets, cross-checked numbers, and posted lists on a public board. The reporter streamed short segments focusing on victims, not the theatrics. Victor watched from afar, curious and cautious. He sent a couple of his lower-level guys to the square to see what was going on. They came pretending to be bystanders, but one of them got careless and tried to sell a batch of lucky tickets to a man who, unknown to him, worked at the NGO and knew serial patterns to look for. That ticket's code matched a batch that had been reported in other neighborhoods as counterfeit. That was the moment the net tightened. The pawnshop ledgers the reporter had quietly obtained showed identical codes being taken for cash at odd hours. A vendor recognized the handwriting on a fake receipt Victor's man used. The pieces snapped together faster than any of them expected. When Victor realized the attention had turned to him, he tried to fade back into the crowd. But the public board had already listed several transactions linked to him. Neighbors called. Had anyone seen Victor? Someone produced a shaky phone clip of him passing tickets to a woman near the fountain. The police liaison stepped forward and took formal statements. He didn't storm Victor down that day, he didn't need to. He collected names, times, and documents. He promised follow-up. The reporter kept the story tight and factual, emphasizing the pattern and the victims rather than sensationalizing faces. That night, stories about the charity verification day trended locally. Comments poured in from people who had reluctantly shrugged off similar scams in the past. One viewer tagged a pawnshop owner who had previously said he couldn't afford to refuse quick cash. Now the owner, under public and legal pressure, started handing over logs to investigators. Pressure like that changes behavior. Victor stopped his public hustle. He moved his operations further underground, but his channels were compromised. That was when he made the mistake he always made when nervous. He grew sloppy. He handed a fake ticket to a woman posing as a tourist who, unknown to him, was actually working with him. A planted actor, respectful and persuasive. She went into a small boutique and tried to cash it in for a verification bonus, arranged by him. The clerk, aware of the day's events, paused. He called a number the NGO had provided, a verification hotline now public, and read out the serial. The number did not match any legit batch. The clerk stalled, asked for ID. Victor's man tried to push, then cursed, and then left. This little scene gave the police the probable cause they'd been building toward. Over the next days, follow-up interviews, ledger comparisons, and the reporters' published evidence created a web that stretched from street sellers to a single operation. Arrests followed, not theatrical raids but coordinated picks-up where the law could act cleanly and avoid claims of entrapment. When the officers finally moved in, Victor's confidence had been hollowed away by a week of scrutiny. He was taken in without drama. His phone contained messages and locations that tied him to other scams. His crew scattered, some pleading ignorance, some offering names in exchange for lesser charges. The district attorney praised the cooperation between citizens, journalists, and law enforcement in a short press release. It was a victory not just for one man who'd been foolish enough to buy a lucky ticket, but for a neighborhood that had tired of being prey. He watched it all, the arrests, the interviews, the slow justice, with a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. Satisfaction because the people who'd fed off others were finally exposed. Emptiness because the high heat imagined after revenge didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like a quiet room where a burden had been set down. But the aftermath was not just legal. The NGO used the day's momentum to run workshops, teaching people how to spot fake tickets, how to verify serial numbers, and how to report with evidence. Pawn shops agreed to new practices. The reporter continued to follow up on smaller players, shining a light where shadows had been comfortable. Change moved slowly, but it moved. He kept one thing from the whole affair: the original fake ticket. He pinned it in a small frame in his apartment. Not as a trophy. As a reminder, being fooled once only mattered if you let it define you. He had let it fuel him instead. In the quiet after the storm, he walked past the market where it all began. Vendors nodded. Some smiled. One old fruit seller whose whisper had started the chase lifted a free orange and offered it to him. He accepted it with a nod. He had set out for $1 million he never owned. He had ended with something better, a community less willing to look away. And for him that was the real win. The city calmed down after Victor's arrest. Headlines faded. People moved on. And for a few weeks he allowed himself to breathe. He thought it was over. But scams never really die that easily. They hide, mutate, wait for another day. One evening while walking home he noticed something strange. A familiar symbol, a small red mark, sprayed on a wall near his building. It was the same symbol he had seen in the notebook Victor's men carried, a kind of sign they used to mark safe drop points. At first he thought it was just old graffiti. But the next day another mark appeared, this time closer to his apartment door. A warning. A message. The network wasn't gone. Some of them were still free. And they wanted him to know it. He felt that rush of fear again, the same fear he'd felt the day the lottery official said, "This ticket is fake." But now fear mixed with anger. Hadn't he done enough? Hadn't justice already been served? Apparently not. Apparently, someone out there wanted to play the game again. This time, though, he wasn't just a victim with a fake ticket. This time he had knowledge, connections, and allies. He started small. He revisited the pawn shops, asking quiet questions. One of them admitted that since Victor's arrest, another name had been circulating: Pavel. A lieutenant of Victor's who had slipped away during the crackdown. And according to whispers, Pavel was angry. Angry that Victor had been caught. Angry that their operation had collapsed. Angry at him for being the spark that burned it all down. He needed to know more. So he reached out to the reporter again. She was cautious but curious. Together they traced small leads, transfers of cash, sudden new ticket batches, whispers of Pavel's draw. It was all coming back, only smaller and more desperate. But desperation was dangerous. Desperate men make reckless moves. One night, his phone buzzed with an anonymous text. It read, "We know where you live. Stay out of this." He stared at the screen. The temptation to panic was strong. But instead he smirked. If they wanted to scare him, they'd made a mistake. Because now he knew they were watching. And if they were watching, that meant he could bait them. He came up with a plan. A risky one. He and the reporter would stage a fake reunion scam, a pretend lottery sale bigger than anything before. They would leak hints in the same channels Pavel's men used. Fake buyers. Fake tickets. A fake chance to rebuild their operation. And Pavel, prideful and greedy, would not resist. He would walk straight into it. The NGO agreed to quietly back the plan, and the police liaison set conditions. No one would actually exchange money, everything had to be documented, and they would be close by ready to act. This wasn't about violence. This was about exposure. Just like before. Light not fist. Pressure not chaos. They set the bait at an abandoned cafe on the edge of the market, a place once used for Victor's meetings. Word spread. By evening, whispers of the big comeback floated across the district. And then Pavel arrived. Not flashy like Victor, but tense, sharp eyes scanning for danger. Two of his men carried envelopes, fat with counterfeit slips. He sat down at the table across from him. "So," Pavel sneered, "you think you can take Victor's place?" He kept his face calm, heart steady. "That depends," he replied, sliding a blank notebook across the table. "Show me what you've got." Pavel smirked, pulling out the batch of fake tickets. At that moment, cameras hidden in the cafe's corners blinked red. The reporter, wired in the next room, whispered to the police liaison, "We've got him." But then, something unexpected. Pavel leaned forward and said quietly, "I know who you are. You're the one who ruined us. You think this is over? It's not. When I walk out of here, you're finished." For a split second, fear pricked him again. But then he smiled. Because Pavel had just admitted, on tape, exactly what they needed. "Then I guess you better hope you do walk out of here," he answered. At that moment, the plainclothes officers entered. Calm, firm, no theatrics. They confiscated the tickets, the envelopes, the notebooks. Pavel fought, shouting that it was entrapment, that nothing was real. But it didn't matter. The recordings were clear. The ledgers matched. And now his threats tied him directly to the previous scams. The arrest didn't feel like a triumph. It felt like closure. This time the rope had tightened completely. No loose ends. No lingering shadow. Afterward, the reporter asked him how he felt. He thought for a moment, then said, "Relieved. Not because it's over, but because they can't hurt anyone else anymore." The story aired the next week under the headline, "Second Ringleader of Lottery Scam Exposed by Victim-Turned-Investigator." Comments flooded in. Some praised him as a hero. Some warned him to stay safe. But for him, the labels didn't matter. What mattered was walking through the market again without glancing over his shoulder. What mattered was the silence where threats used to be. What mattered was that he had turned his worst mistake into someone else's downfall, twice. And with that, he finally folded the fake ticket, the one he had framed for so long, and burned it. Because he no longer needed the reminder. The lesson was carved into him forever.